Witkoff agreed there can't be any enrichment. This puts us in the unfortunate position of having to follow through on enormous numbers of threats that we've made to strike Iran. I don't see how we avoid it. And I think that's what Mr. Netanyahu wants. The key thing is that if you're going to attack Israel with air and naval power, in other words, essentially missiles and bombs, what is your goal? What do you expect to accomplish? Now, I don't think anybody on the United States Armed Forces believes that our goal is to ultimately defeat Iran. If you want to defeat the Iranian state, then you're going to have to introduce ground forces into the mix. Air and naval power alone isn't going to achieve that. So I don't think the objective is to, quote unquote, defeat Iran. I think the objective will be to defeat their integrated air defenses and defeat their missile attacks, while at the same time destroying the nuclear capability on the ground to enrich, and also potentially to destroy the regime, because there have been lots of statements suggesting if we're going to go in there, then we have to target the regime itself, hopefully then leaving Iran leaderless and incoherent. If they understood that, they would go back and do what we've urged them to do from the very beginning. President Trump says this is not his war. Okay, end all further aid to this government in Ukraine and pull us out. Get all the Americans that are in Ukraine, military or otherwise, intelligence, civilian, they all leave. All he's done by failing to do that is extend the Biden policy. But President Trump seems to lack self-awareness, Judge. He doesn't seem to grasp that he is monumentally responsible for this war continuing. Our cash, our equipment continues to pour in. The recent attacks or attempted attacks on the 9 May celebration in Red Square consisted of ATACMS missiles. They didn't show up magically on their own. They didn't come from Great Britain or Germany. They're ours. Surely he must understand that.
Didn't?
Doesn't make sense. He ever grasped what was really happening on the ground in Ukraine. This was presented to him as more foreign aid and military assistance to a future NATO member. What does he know about Ukraine? Nothing. What does he know about Russia? Frankly, nothing. Again, you get this transactional response. So I think he's just simply said to the Saudis, and I think he'll say the same thing in the Emirates, let's let bygones be bygones. Whether or not that works, I don't know. I learned that Mr. Alexander was an Israeli from New Jersey. I thought everybody from New Jersey was an American. I thought it was very strange. For many years, we had laws in the books that said that if you served in the armed forces of another state, you lost your citizenship. If you voted in an election in a foreign state, you lost your citizenship. Then there was a Supreme Court ruling in 1965, with which you may be more familiar than I am, that overturned that. I'm someone who's never been comfortable with the idea of multiple citizenships. Either you are an American or you are not. And that was the view of the founders, and I tend to subscribe to that view. I don't know what people think today inside the United States Armed Forces. I know what I thought, and I think most of us, at least when I was serving, and that's up until 2004, and even in the years that followed, were very uncomfortable with people who were loyal to something other than the United States.
Right.
So the notion of $1 trillion defense budget is not only full from the standpoint of threats to the United States, because most of the threats that concern us are in our own hemisphere. It's also dangerous, Judge. We can't afford it. It will sink us in our economy. Just bring in Senators Graham and Cotton, along with many others, and they'll tell you that's insane. We live on a hair trigger of a major global war. We can't spare a dime. In fact, I think the opposite is the case. People are looking for reasons to justify this defense expenditure. That means that you've got to find places to go, places to become involved, and places to fight. I mean, just look recently in Africa, we've been largely expelled from the continent by many different governments. And we thought Africa was this wonderful plane of opportunity where we could go in and fight Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra or any number of branches of Islamists in perpetuity. And this is wonderful. It's crazy. The idea that perhaps the best thing we can do for most of the world is leave it alone, not interfere in it, is simply foreign to everybody in Washington. I think there's a great deal of evidence for that. And I don't know how you fix that one. Keep in mind that I'm absolutely confident that President Trump wants to do what he thinks is in the best interest of the American people. Figuring out what the best interests are is for him very challenging. He spent his life in New York real estate. First, the Iranians have made it very clear that they are not abandoning their nuclear power capability, nor are they prepared to give up enrichment or anything else. They're certainly not going to give up their missile arsenal and their theater ballistic missile capabilities. I don't know how you reach an agreement that includes those things without deeply offending and alienating Mr. Netanyahu. So I think you're right to raise that question. The question is that then the trigger for Mr. Netanyahu to launch his Israeli-only attack on Iran? And perhaps we shouldn't exclude this. I would not exclude the possibility that the British and the French don't aid the Israelis. So even if we're not initially involved, they could support him because they have strange interests in the region. The British especially, who meddled in the Middle East for centuries, they would like to gain control of Iran's oil and natural gas fields. And I think the French would eagerly jump into that as well. So I think there are other dangers, other things in play. So simply because we say we don't think so doesn't mean it can't happen. Some people say they're joined at the hip.
And you have to ask yourself, these people are obviously not Jewish. What are they doing there? And they're not the first ones by any means. Large numbers of members of this administration have trooped over there. We've had other governors go there to sign bills into law that essentially transform Jews into a protected class inside the United States. And again, as I've said before, and if I were in that position, I would not want to be transformed into a protected class in America, no matter what I was. But nevertheless, these things are real. You talk about moral authority, and I am glad that she's speaking out, and that's a very good thing. But there was an example of something similar when Napoleon Bonaparte was approached by one of his staff officers and said, the Pope in Rome is not going to like this and he won't approve it. And the answer from Napoleon was, how many battalions has the Pope got? I think today it's no longer a question of how many battalions anybody has. It's a question of how much money they have. And enormous quantities of money are backing this policy and ensuring that it will be carried out in Israel. We can't do it. We're still in the same position. What he's trying to argue is that you can have an Iron Dome-like solution that Israel has employed and employ it nationwide. Or if not nationwide, then selectively for large urban areas. It depends on who you talk to. But the point is the Iron Dome is by no means perfect. And it has been penetrated and will be penetrated in the future. So this is another money pit for lots of people who are very anxious to see this money flow. And I think they're on the Hill. I think they're in the Department of Defense, in a number of other agencies across the federal government, and of course, across the country. Here's the rest of the story. It's not going to happen. We can't afford it. It's unattainable. It's back to this thing we used to refer to in the building as unobtainium. You can't break the laws of physics to get there and the laws of fractal mathematics. And that's the simple truth. So you're not going to get what they want. Whether or not you get something out of any of these programs is much less important than spending the money. You go to the Hill and you ask, what do you do here? And everybody will tell you, we spend money. I don't think President Trump really figures that dramatically in the whole equation. I think everything turns on what Mr. Netanyahu decides to do and the enormous support for him that exists in the Senate and the House. So I think at this stage, what would President Trump say? I don't know. He might say, I'm disappointed, but I'm going to support my friend Bibi and Israel. And I think that's what would happen. And I think President Trump knows that he has control. It may periodically irritate or anger President Trump. And I think he knows that Mr. Netanyahu will have the final say. And I think thus far, Mr. Netanyahu has made it pretty clear what he wants. And he wants the application of the Libya model. And I see no evidence that he's walked away from that. I think Israel is hardly democratic. And I don't know that you would get anybody today watching what's going on inside Israel and describe that as democratic. Stalin used to believe in something called prophylactic justice. It was essentially kill the citizen before the citizen has an opportunity to commit a crime. And I think that's where Mr. Netanyahu is. And if anyone is demonizing anything, he is demonizing Israel and himself. And I'm the big man with the big stick. And if I just beat everyone over the head and say, make peace, they'll have to make peace. That's childish nonsense. There are hundreds of years of complexity involved in this whole thing. It is the joint hegemony over the region that we are trying to promote with Turkish and Israeli military power. It's very fragile because the Turks collectively as people are utterly opposed to everything the Israelis are doing. I don't think it's going to last. But Mr. Erdogan sees great value in it. And Mr. Jelani, people are saying he's a CIA asset. Okay, fine, perhaps he is, but he's very definitely Mr. Erdogan's asset. And so you're signaling to President Erdogan, I'm going to go along with what you want to do, just as I'm going to go along with what Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. The Russians are trying to protect the Alawites that are within range of their base. The Alawites have tended to pull back towards the coast in the direction of the Russian military base. And remember that Erdogan has instructed Jolani and his legions, whatever they are, not to attack the Russians. So I think the Russians are going to do whatever they can. Remember, the Russians have always been prepared to intervene on behalf of Christian populations under attack. By the way, the Iranians also saved Christians from destruction when they were fighting ISIS, because that's his view of the Palestinians, that the best solution is the final solution for the Palestinians. And he doesn't like the fact that this is being rejected by most of the world, certainly not in the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere is very clearly under his influence, if not outright control and authority in many respects. But the rest of the world really isn't, and they see it for what it is. By the way, the ICC was not established to prevent another Holocaust. It was established to halt war crimes. And again, this is an attempt to place himself and his supporters at the center of the universe and to immunize them against any possible accusation of impropriety or criminal action. But that doesn't go down well with the rest of the world. He may get away with that here in the Anglosphere, but nowhere else. I think we have to understand that there are people here in the United States that believe that. I think everyone wants to separate Judaism from Zionism. And I'm sure in some cases that's true, but in many cases that certainly isn't true. So I'd be surprised if people welcome that kind of thing. But obviously, if you have a lot of Jewish constituents and you're looking for donors from that community, that's a very good trick to play. And listen, we've had lots of evidence, and this is kind of what I regard as legalized corruption. Lots of evidence for the Kushners and the Trumps and Witkoff and so forth, all doing business on the side with Qatar and profiting from it enormously. It's the sort of thing that the right complained about with Hunter Biden. We see some of the same sort of thing going on right now. I find it distasteful, and I think it's in bad form, and I think it's probably illegal. But I don't see any evidence that anywhere is going to do anything about it. If he hasn't figured out that the Greater Israel Project is a suicidal path for the Israeli people and their state, then he's missing the boat completely. That's why we're here. But it's going to be awfully tough to avoid. And that's why I think any number of things could happen. You could have a false flag. We've been through that before with the white helmets on the ground in Syria, and twice they managed to precipitate missile strikes. Fortunately, those missiles all went into the desert sand because somebody had the sense to realize if they go anywhere else, you're going to kill a lot of people and find yourself at war. This time around, I'm not sure that's possible. So I think you could have a false flag, or you could simply have the decision, we have been provoked long enough. It is an existential threat to Greater Israel, and we are going to act. Mr. Netanyahu gives a speech, and off it goes. And then we're dragged in anyway. Again, how do you bring peace about under those circumstances if we are a co-belligerent? We're back to the same problem we had today in Ukraine. How can you broker peace when you are, in fact, part of the problem? I don't think we can do that in Ukraine. I don't think we'll be able to do it in the Middle East. Since there is no long-term strategic framework that we can follow, no coherent strategy, then I think we have to be careful and scale back our expectations. What he's saying and doing at this point could, in fact, within a week or 2 weeks, change. If you know absolutely nothing about the region, about the people involved, the culture, the history, the geography, then I suppose you could make statements along the lines of what President Trump made. As much as it disturbs me to say so, I find myself in agreement with current Secretary of State Rubio, who then said this is not a real estate deal. This, I think, has been the bottom line difficulty for President Trump. He views everything as transactional and views everything as a negotiation with a transactional outcome. And he tends to fall back on his experience as a real estate mogul in New York City. And those things do not necessarily transfer easily to the international system. There's no basis for expecting the rest of the world to see everything through that distorting lens. So I think in this case, Mr. Rubio is right. He's still right. And I hope that President Trump has finally concluded that.
And ever since then, the Russians have had to come to the realization that it didn't matter what they did. We were going to work tirelessly to destroy them. So they've recovered. They are now certainly the leading ground military power in the world today. I don't think there is an army anywhere that could stand up to them. And I think they've exerted tremendous control over airspace as a result of their advances in air defense technology and so forth. My point is that President Trump doesn't have any credibility anymore. He makes it sound as though he and President Trump are both members of a golf club. And he's unhappy because President Putin decided to change something on the putting green. And he doesn't like it. And he just doesn't understand it because he thought they were friends. This is all nonsense. This has always been the kind of problem that I think President Trump has. He personalizes everything. He thinks that the power of his personality is preeminent and all-powerful. It isn't. Things in international relations are about interests. They are not about personal relationships. And I think that's the way we have to look at whatever they do. If they're doing something, it's after quite a lot of deliberation, and it could be what I just described, or it could be something else. If you look at all of the operations they have inevitably involved on the tactical and operational levels, in encompassing and circling and then destroying systematically what's inside the circle and then moving further on, but always very incrementally. This may indicate a desire to send something further west than they have in the past in the hopes of potentially convincing the regime to evacuate Kiev, or us, for instance, to intervene and talk. Who knows? But I really think at this stage, they're making decisions on the basis of what they believe is in Russia's interests. And I don't think they're listening very much to us anymore because they've seen too much vacillation, too much change. They don't see the evidence for any coherent strategic framework. Everything is impulse driven, and the impulses come straight from the president. He speaks without a great deal of self-awareness. He simply says what he wants to. That may go down well domestically with his supporters. We need to stop and understand what is not happening in this administration. You're familiar with the National Security Council staff. That was established under President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower had been through the Second World War and its aftermath. He was a big believer in the criticality of having very competent analysts on your staff, people that could analyze, understand, evaluate, and review material, and then present to the president for his own consumption their assessment. And he was very careful about who ended up on the National Security Council staff and who came in to brief him. And so as a result, Eisenhower believed in the staffing process. So when he got a military operational plan, when he received a plea for money for some aspect of national security, it would be staffed. It would be thoroughly analyzed, brought back to him. He would review it, and he would make a decision. This is not happening inside the Trump administration. There is no such process. And as a result, it's hard to tell what the president actually knows and understands because there's not much evidence that he reads and studies what's handed to him. If they were dealing exclusively with Israel, that would be different. But no one really wants to go to war with us. This is something you and I have discussed over and over again for years.
Right.
No one in the world is interested in going to war with us. We're the ones that are talking about war all the time. So that's number one. They want to do business with us. Number two, if you're an Egyptian, you probably feel comfortable with dealing with the IDF. In other words, if you have to fight them, you can fight them. But what do you do if hundreds of aircraft fly off of carriers and come in from overseas to utterly devastate you on behalf of Israel. And right now, that's what they expect. The Turks, of course, would like to extract benefits from their cooperation with us. And by the way, one of the things that nobody brings up is that one of the key reasons that President Trump went to the region and ultimately talked to this man Jelani and shook his hand and talked about what an attractive young man he is because he's trying to hold together this CIA Mossad brokered alliance between the Turks and the Israelis.
This notion that somehow or another you can arbitrarily state that there are vast stretches of other people's countries that belong to you, and then you state that you're going to physically seize them, ostensibly because they have the backing of the United States, should be regarded as very distasteful by President Trump. Maybe he's waking up to that. But why he would have ever supported any of it to begin with is the real question.
Netanyahu.
Remember that President Trump has this habit of flipping back and forth between different poles and different points of view. We've discussed that in the past. On the one hand, he recognizes Russia's legitimate security interests. He recognizes that they are not responsible for this terrible war, that we, in fact, push this regime and fight this war. So then he takes a 180-degree turn and starts repeating the popular neocon slogans that Russia wants all of Ukraine and threatens Eastern Europe, and we get this sort of stupid warmed-over domino theory, which has absolutely no application. So when you turn to the Middle East, I think we have to be very careful. This is what he's saying now.
Now, I don't think those things are achievable, but it's not defeat Iran. It's what I just described. And I think there are a lot of people in the Air Force and the Navy, senior officers, telling the president that, yes, we think we can do that. I think that what has got to happen to make all of this come together is the Israelis have to take the lead. And this has always been my concern, that Mr. Netanyahu would make it impossible for us to stay out by taking the lead in terms of attacking Iran. Iran then in response would probably let everything they've got go at Israel. In other words, it would trigger a massive response from Iran. That in turn would trigger us to try and intervene and protect, if not save, Israel from potential destruction at the hands of Iranian missiles. So I'm not sure it's that clear. What Mr. Netanyahu knows is that he has infinitely more influence over what the Senate and the House will do in this instance than Trump does. And it was appalling. Everyone who was in the physics department that I knew, and one of whom was with me when we listened to him, told me, and I'm not a physicist, but this man it was, and he just said, Douglas, this is outrageous nonsense. But today, can the Russians really believe in any offer of neutrality that we make? What can they believe from anything that is said to them in Europe? Remember, we go back to the Minsk Accords. You remember that? They learned a hard lesson there. They believed and they were taken advantage of. So now they ask, how long can we do this? Now, the good news for the Russians militarily is if you control everything up to the Dnieper River, you are in a position to devastate anything on the other side that looks dangerous to you. In other words, you don't necessarily have to cross over and occupy anything if you don't want to. And I don't think they do, for the reasons I just outlined. I explained the true nature of Ukraine, particularly its western edge. They want nothing to do with that. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that in Moscow, the Russians would welcome the Poles to come back in because they know the Poles and the Ukrainians hate each other, and you'd end up having a Polish-Ukrainian war in the West. This place is a mess. We don't understand it. We know nothing about it. And so we treat it as President Trump has, as, well, this is just a misunderstanding. So you have this country that divides into three parts. Today, the East is gone. That is now part of Russia. I suspect more of it will become part of Russia in the days and months ahead. The question is what happens in the rest of the country, because tens of millions of people have left. And most of the Ukrainians on their way out were asked, when will you come back? And virtually all of them that were asked at the border in Poland, where my sources are, said, we're not going back. We have no intention of ever going back. So under those circumstances, the question is, can Ukraine independently as a sovereign state emerge from this and go on into the future as a viable entity? I suppose some rump form of it might, but not all of it by any stretch of the imagination. The quickest way to end this conflict is for President Trump to end any further aid to the regime in Kiev. simply say, until you are willing to negotiate in good faith, no more aid, no more support. Secondly, to get all U.S. military, intelligence, and civilian personnel out of Ukraine and make it very clear we're getting out. We're no longer supporting this. Christian lives were saved along with Shiite lives. So this is an ongoing problem in the region. Iran and Russia are both involved in that. But there's another feature to all of this, and you brought it up when you mentioned BRICS. The other reason for the president's activities in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates is to try and persuade them not to become part of BRICS, to stay out of the sort of Chinese herd of potential cooperative customers. That's impossible. They're going to join BRICS. It doesn't matter what we say or do, but they also want to do business with us. This is something that I don't think President Trump understands just yet. Mr. Witkoff is simply repeating the instructions that were given to President Trump by Mr. Netanyahu. It is Mr. Netanyahu that said that's off the table. We cannot tolerate any enrichment of any kind. He's also made it clear that he and Israel will not tolerate the presence of all these ballistic missiles that could reach them. In other words, we're back to the Libyan model. That's the model he wants. Now, President Trump hasn't been willing to support that, at least not on the whole. But President Trump has now, obviously, through Mr.
That you'll hear from the Joint Chiefs, frequently from the intelligence services, all of which justifies this vastly bloated Defense Department bill. The other piece of it is it completely ignores the dramatic technological changes and advances that make most of our armed force today not entirely obsolete, but certainly less useful than it's ever been before. So why would you then pump hundreds of billions of dollars into the old force? It doesn't make any sense. But there has never been any willingness since 1991 on the Hill, under any circumstances, to entertain a fundamental change in strategy. Instead of saying NATO no longer serves its original purpose, we're backing down from command and control in NATO. We'll be supportive, but this should be a European-driven alliance with European interests at the forefront. We've said the opposite. We have to find new things for our European allies to do in places like the Middle East, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world. We judge that we want to wage war or pursue a conflict. All of this is obfuscation. It needs to go away, but no one will stand up and tell the truth. Clearly, the Mossad exercises a very pernicious and potentially dangerous influence inside the CIA. Could this be true? Of course it can be true. We have an expression in the Army: intelligence is always wrong. And that's not entirely out of character for what we're hearing now. Could there be something else? Absolutely. During this latest Indo-Pakistani conflict, we know that the Indians ostensibly or allegedly accidentally struck a nuclear storage site about which they claim they didn't know. That's one of the reasons the Pakistanis said, look, let's call a halt to this. It's possible. I can't confirm it one way or the other, but it's not impossible. But again, if you define your national interests as inextricably intertwined with other people's wars and conflicts around the world, that there could be no safety in the United States until Iran is destroyed, that unless Russia is beaten to a pulp, there's no safety for U.S. interests in Europe, unless Taiwan is preserved in perpetuity and protected against the possibility of reunification with China, then the world as we know it will fall apart. That's the kind of talk and nonsense, as you know, Judge.
But it doesn't help us at all in the international system. Let's be frank, Ukraine, for most of its history, was never an independent country. It was a region. And if you look at Ukraine, certainly at the time that this 2014 coup occurred and we installed this government that's become a radical nationalist entity aimed at Russia's destruction, you could look at Ukraine in three parts. You could see the far eastern part of the country is Russian, fundamentally, culturally, linguistically. And if you want to attach ethnicity to it, you can attach that to it. Then in the center, you had this, some of it on the east side, most of it on the west side of the river. You have this hybrid area where even the language itself is not really Ukrainian. It's not pure Russian. It's something of a mix.
although cities like Kharkov and Kiev at the beginning of this war were all Russian-speaking places. And then you have the far west, which is very different and is probably, in strictest terms, thoroughly Ukrainian. It does have a regional identity, but for most of its existence, it's lived under Polish-Lithuanian rule. Some of it was under Austrian and Swedish rule. Again, but it's different. So under those circumstances, it's hard to imagine anything good coming out of this, although I think President Trump has a habit of hearing what he wants to hear. And I think he heard a willingness to end the war, which is clear. Nobody in Russia wants this war to go on in perpetuity, least of all Vladimir Putin. They've lost 120, 130,000 killed. I don't know how many wounded. The Ukrainian losses, of course, are much higher, probably 1.5 million killed in action. How many wounded is anybody's guess. But Zelensky's in no mood to accommodate anything connected with Russia's core position. It's also pretty clear if you look at the numbers of discontented officers and soldiers in the Ukrainian army, that if fighting were to stop in eastern Ukraine for any length of time, I think tens of thousands of Ukrainian veterans would turn their attentions to Zelensky in Kiev. And I don't think he would survive it. I think there's great bitterness right now in the field towards the regime in Kiev. And they hold him responsible for these massive losses and dramatic failures. I don't think there's an understanding of that in the Trump administration at all. Look at all the money we just effectively garnered during our trip to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. We'll set aside whether or not that's actual and real. And just think about that statement. And we've lost hundreds of billions in Ukraine. What is going on here? This is not the art of the deal. We're talking about national interests and the survival of peoples and nations. It doesn't seem to sink in with him at all.
Rubio.
I don't know what the vice president is saying, because the vice president is equally uninformed about Ukraine and Russia. I don't see much evidence he understands what's happening over there. The only thing he has said, which is to his credit, is I think we should terminate this and move on. Okay, thank you very much. But there's no understanding of what that means. How do you terminate it? And you have to terminate it along the lines we just discussed. You can't make statements that say, I've had it, we're leaving, we're walking out. You have to end the aid, and you have to start withdrawing everyone who's part of it. This is the problem the Europeans are having, because on the one hand, he says these things, I want to end this, and this is bad. And to this, you must add millions of evangelical Christians who choose to interpret the Old Testament and passages in it to justify whatever the Israelis do as essentially blessed by God. How God in their minds would bless mass murder and expulsion from people's homes and land is beyond my imagination. I don't see anything Christian in it, but nevertheless, they're there. So we have to accept the fact that, yes, some of what he says truly resonates here in the Anglosphere. I don't think a phone call from Donald Trump would stop it, because, as I said before, this is largely out of his hands. I think he's in a position from which he cannot easily escape, where the power to decide what we will do really rests with the enormous power and influence that Mr. Netanyahu exerts inside the United States through the media, through his agents, the donor class, and ultimately in Washington itself with the Senate and the House. All one has to do is look over the last few days at photographs of, I think it was the Director of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, praying at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. More recently, Governor Abbott from Texas. I think President Trump respects them and wants their goodwill. Now, I don't know how that's going to work, but I think that's his ultimate goal. It's not so much, I'm here to sell you more military equipment, although I'm sure that will come up. And I suspect the Saudis will probably buy some. But I think it's more along the lines of, let's recognize that the last years have been difficult. The last few months have been hard, and that's over. I think that's what he wants to tell the Saudis. How they will receive that, who knows? But let's be frank, and no one in the international community, and that may also be true for many people in Israel, who've had to deal with Mr. Netanyahu have liked the man. Most of them regard him as an arrogant sociopath.
And given what's happened in Gaza, he may well deserve the title of psychopath. So at this point, I don't think it costs President Trump very much at home with his enormous followers in the Jewish community, donors, to make it clear that he's unhappy with the behavior of Mr. Netanyahu. Now, beyond that, I don't think we should reach any conclusions. And then he turns around and tells Europeans that the Russians are now flexible and willing to negotiate and are ready to sign up for a ceasefire, when they know categorically that's not true, because the initial conditions that the Russians have always stipulated have not been met. So I think there's confusion across the board. The only people that are not confused are Moscow and Zelensky. Zelensky knows what he wants, which may involve the complete death of his own country, his nation, but that's what he's going to stand on. I think that Israel lobby has absolute unchallenged control over what's happening on the ground in Gaza. And that means that people in Washington are going to unconditionally support Mr. Netanyahu and whatever he decides to do with the forces at his disposal. There's nothing that's changed. I remember Gaza is this wonderful piece of real estate that, if it were only simply developed the right way, would be a mecca for everyone. That's the president's view. I don't know what to make of it. There is, but all of these governments, and this is very important for everybody to understand, are afraid of U.S. military intervention on Israel's side against them.